I always thought love would be the one thing that made me soft in the places my family had sharpened into survival tools. Turns out, love can also be a scalpel, and sometimes the surgeon is someone you trusted to stitch you up. Stella was my cousin, my childhood co-conspirator, my risal in every mirror. She had that glossy, done-up look people paid for with more than money. Posture, the right laugh, an instinct for levers. Who to charm, when to withdraw, which rumor to feed at which dinner. She moved through rooms like she owned the lighting. I used to admire that in her because the admiration felt safe, like a private respect for someone cleverer than me. I learned the rules of restraint in a family that measured worth with exchange rates and invitations. Stella learned the rules of taking. We grew up 2 summers apart, but on the same block of privilege. Nannies with the patience of saints, tutors who smelled like almonds, parents whose calendars read like endorsements. Family dinners were performances where everyone pretended not to be calculating. Stella learned how to pick locks that weren't metal, doors made of eyes and ego. She was always the cousin who could wink and get you an upgrade. When she smiled at my fiancés, it felt like sunlight hitting broken glass. Pretty, dangerous, scattering into tiny cutting slivers. I said fiancé because I dated like someone who kept a ledger. Names, dates, potential. I listed them as one collects investment properties. Temperate, promising, managed. I wasn't naive. I was cautious, deliberate, the kind of person who double-checked plane tickets and therapists. When I met Marcus, everything tilted. Marcus had a laugh like someone who'd been giving back something he'd lost. He had pockets of kindness, the way he held doors for people in heels and the way his eyes softened when he talked about his brother. He liked architecture and old jazz records. He had a temper, sure, but it was a contained thing, like a vase with a crack. He belonged to a different kind of world than mine, one he was trying to fit into. That made him real. That made me dangerous enough to want him. Stella loved danger in a different, performative way. She consumed people the way collectors consume art, possessively, publicly, always with a story to sell later. The first time I noticed the way she watched Marcus at my birthday party was stupidly small, a tilt of her head that could have been curiosity. Then there was the way her hand lingered on his sleeve a moment longer, as if establishing a claim. People overlooked those things with Stella because she was magnetic, which is a polite word for predatory when used by the right mouths. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself Stella and I had a history and that our sibling rivalry was theater. I told myself the story I wanted to believe, that she was harmless and I was secure. She wasn't harmless. She was a calculated hurricane. The first full-body betrayal looked like coincidence until it felt like choreography. Marcus had gone to a gallery opening with me. I remember how the chandelier made his skin look like warm honey. We danced the conversation we always did, teasing, slightly fierce, territorial in the most tender ways. Stella arrived at the gallery late, wrapped in a Versace throw disguised as a coat, breathless with a schedule of other people's calendars. She moved through the room handing compliments like counterfeit bills that somehow convinced people because of the confidence behind them. At some point, she and Marcus drifted into a conversation about a mid-century architect he admired. I watched them from across the room like a spectator at an exhibit, thinking of nothing until I noticed the way Marcus's shoulders softened, how he angled toward her in that unconscious way men do when they're listening to someone who admires what they admire. I felt it in my gut, a tightening like when you hear your own name in a room and know you didn't speak. After that night, things began to happen with the stealth of a snowball rolling downhill. Stella would text me under the pretense of brunch plans and then leave me on red for hours, long enough to make me doubt myself. She would show up at events I thought were private, as if our family's definition of private meant an RSVP, not discretion. She befriended Marcus's friends like she had a directory of insecurities and knew which ones required flattery. It was petty in the beginning. A selfie my mother tagged, and Stella commented, "Wow, gorgeous couple," like a small jab wrapped in an emoji. It was tender in the middle. She sent Marcus playlists with low-key messages, playlists titled Midnight Thinking and For Clarity, as if the songs might be primers for confession. Stella's arrows were thin, but she reined them, and Marcus, being soft, didn't know how to shield himself. I told him plainly one night after dinner, on our balcony overlooking the city's vertical heartbeat. The air smelled like car exhaust and lemon-scented happiness. I said, "She's crossing lines. I'm not asking for a fight. I'm asking for boundaries." He nodded like he did when I spoke in spreadsheets and strategies. "I know. She's charming. It's a lot." It was a sentence that didn't commit. It was the kind of sentence people use to pretend they're protecting you while they take a step back to see how dramatic you'll be. You learn over time how people use language to move without leaving fingerprints. Marcus was one of those people who loved hard but hated confrontation. He wanted the version of peace that comes with capital P, peace. Easy, clean, untroubled. He didn't like the messy edges where people's lives overlap in the inky dark. That meant that he retreated when things escalated, not out of cruelty, but because he couldn't bear the violence of my hurt. That retreat looked like silence, then neglect, then complicity. Stella saw the white space where my voice dropped and moved in like a scriptwriter filling stage directions. Her tactics evolved: charm at brunches, gossip as currency, the slow art of suggestion. "You and Marcus are adorable," she said at another dinner, and when I looked at her face, there was an almost imperceptible shadow, like a curtain pulled just a hair. At the charity gala she invited us to last spring, she sat between us at dinner, a wedge of glass meant to refract conversation away from me. She called Marcus an old soul in front of a table of donors, and I watched with the strange mixture of humiliation and fascination that comes from knowing you're being outmaneuvered. Sometimes she would catch my eye across a room and smile. The smile that said, "I know something you don't." I began to keep lists in my head, small betrayals, escalating. The list kept growing like a debt. I am not a vindictive person by nature. I am a planner. I am someone who believes in the slow architecture of consequence. But grief is a funny fuel. It burns everything you thought you were and leaves embers shaped like memory. The real fracture wasn't when Marcus laughed at one of Stella's jokes in front of me. The real fracture was when he kissed her. It was not a cinematic, dramatic affair. There were no slow-motion gazes. It was an accident of proximity, amplified by wine and the brittle politeness of a family gathering where boundaries are optional and people drink to level their social terrain. I went to get another glass of champagne. Their heads were bent, close enough that I should have seen the outline of his cheekbone, the way his mouth softened. By the time I came back, they had pulled apart, like people who had just been caught in a quiet mistake. Her lipstick was a bright, smug red on his cheek. Her expression was a masterclass in controlled triumph, a look that said, "Oops, did that happen?" Marcus looked like a man who had experienced an avalanche and couldn't figure out which way to run. I didn't storm out. I stayed and heard the rest of the night as if I had been eavesdropping on a radio station broadcasting in another language. Words are the first currency of betrayal. "It meant nothing," Marcus told me later, his voice full of the kind of apologetic thrift that didn't buy much. "I was wasted. It was a mistake," she said to me in an hour where she found me folding laundry because it was the only thing that made me feel like I could organize my life. "I know I would never—" Her voice dissolved into that syrup of charm she used when she needed forgiveness.
Forgiveness is not a dollar you can spend. Forgiveness is a thing inside you that either heals or rots. I felt a new bitterness. It was less like anger and more like recognition that Stella had always been waiting in the wings, auditioning. She had wanted more than to be admired. She wanted to be desired by the things that made me precious, as if aesthetics were trophies and my life had been a showcase window she could rearrange. I did not react in the ways people expected. I did not scream in public or throw plates. I did not make the kind of Instagram that works like a detonator. Instead, I began to watch. There is a particular clarity that comes from observing the person who betrayed you. People who manipulate for sport assume they are invisible. They aren't. They are loud in soft ways. Texts sent at 2 a.m, the careful schedule of appearances, the way they monitor who is where. Stella's hubris was that she believed her beauty and her social savvy made her invisible. My revenge would be designed around making her visible, painfully visible, in the places she had always wanted to be unseen. Family rooms, charity galas, social feeds. Public humiliation with emotional stakes, not financial. I wanted her to lose what she craved, the script that let her be the villain in someone else's story without consequence. I started with small things, surgical wounds disguised as accidents. When Stella asked to borrow dresses, I made sure the zip was slightly stuck, so the sound of fabric against satin would be an audible memory. When she wanted to sit at the head of my family table, I forgot to pass along the urgent invitation right away and observed how quickly she tried to salvage status. It was petty in the way a seed can be petty, but seeds grow. And then I began to tell stories. Only half-truths, stories told with the precision of a whisper. You learn how to weaponize narrative when you've spent holidays around a table of people who believe the currency of a story is its repetition. I would make a joke about Stella's taste in men at the exact speed at which gossip spreads. I cultivated allies like gardeners cultivate soil. Carefully, persistently. I fed them crumbs of Stella's inconsistency, the way she left dinner early with a sore throat and turned up at another party like clockwork. People are hungry for narratives that fit their internal dramas. I supplied a plotline with a rhythm they could hum. The first big public crack happened at my engagement party. I had asked for something intimate, a safe space, a night to breathe, before marriage felt like a suit I would wear forever. Stella offered to help, which should have been my first red flag. She had a way of offering that looked like charity, but always came wrapped in receipt requirements. She handled the guest list and the table placements, wrote the program note, and, as I learned later, sent out an extra invite to some family friends who were actually friends of hers. The party was beautiful. It looked like a lifestyle blog come to life. There were orchids, a pianist, a bar with cocktails named after cities we pretend to love. People were in heels and silk. I remember standing under the light and feeling like someone who had accomplished something true. Stella performed her generosity like an award ceremony. She kissed my cheek in front of people, cooed about how delicious the cake was. And at the end of the night, she pulled Marcus to the side and whispered. I watched them because watching had become my method. Later, as if rehearsed, she stepped onto a small chair and said a thank you speech that was technically about my parents, but actually about me. She said, "We should all raise a glass to the people who think they can make any room look better by standing in it." The line landed like a stone. People laughed politely, someone clinked a glass. Marcus's eyes dropped to the floor in a way that said he was thinking about the kiss and its consequences, which classified him as a man who could be flattered into pity. I felt a hollowing move through me that was less like sadness than like the sound of a lock turning. After the party, text messages circulated. Someone filmed the speech and uploaded it under a caption that read, "Subtweet level, family." The internet, our small curated internet, lit up with mean-witted commentary. People took sides. I watched inboxes fill with things that felt like knives. Stella seemed untouchable. She smiled into her phone like someone who feeds on spectacle. But I had ignited a chain of small but pointed questions in the backgrounds of people's minds. Do we know her? They asked. Is she always like this? My campaign wasn't about slander. It was about the slow, accumulating recognition of pattern. The biggest blow to Stella's carefully curated life wasn't mine to deliver all at once. It came in fragments. An old college roommate reached out with a story about a scholarship Stella had lost because she didn't show up to class. A story about responsibility. A former boss commented under a post about professionalism with a vague note about accountability. The internet, which Stella assumed would mirror the polished image she projected, instead began to host small mirrors that showed her in different angles. People who had once done favors for her started to distance themselves quietly, which is often a kinder punishment than any public insult, a social freeze that is more painful than a slap. Stella reacted like anyone who has built identity on admiration, with gaslighting, with deflection, with the kind of charm that doubles as denial. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill," she told me when I finally said something that wasn't folded into humor. "This is petty. Marcus and I were fine. You need to chill." The sentence was sweet with threat. If I chilled, she'd have happily rewritten the narrative. I didn't. I leaned into the discord because watching her scramble for normalcy was watching someone realize for the first time that they might be mortal. Being the person who is wronged is a peculiar position. It gives you permission for a kind of ferocity that is strangely equitable. You don't get to decide how justice looks, but you get to decide the theater. I did not want monetary ruin for Stella. Money could be replaced. What she had loved more than cash was the way the room leaned when she entered. I wanted to take that away and leave her with hollow applause. The turning point was not a huge scandal. It was a photograph posted at the wrong time. Stella had always been fastidious about the currency of images. She curated not only her public life, but also her intimacies. She posted the exact right photos at the exact right moments. A charity gala where she was seen donating, a vacation where she looked casually philanthropic. One night, she posted a photo with Marcus, a warm, candid shot of him laughing. The comments were a bouquet of sympathy emojis and awws, but someone on the thread recognized the arm around Marcus as one she had recently slung around another man in a way that suggested more than friendship. The commenter tagged a mutual acquaintance and wrote, "Funny how life repeats itself." The tag threaded into other comments, and before long, a user I barely knew posted a collage of moments: Stella laughing with men at different events, Stella close to someone at a resort who later posted an Instagram story with the caption, "Private nights." The collage wasn't an accusation, it was evidence of pattern. Pattern is often the enemy of charm. Stella's countenance changed. She tried to calm the storm with fervor, long apologies, private messages promising they had all been misunderstandings. But the worst humiliation for someone like her is being understood. People she trusted began to tell stories that made sense of her behavior. That she had left relationships when things got tough. That she ghosted sometimes for weeks and returned with new lives in her bag. The people who had once thought her indomitable now saw her as someone who had become addicted to the idea of being wanted. Marcus, to his credit, unraveled in the way men do when they realize they have been complicit in their own diminishment. He loved me in a way that was flawed and real, and when the dust settled and he faced the person he had kissed in a moment of weakness, he couldn't live with himself. He chose to be honest publicly. He stood at a gathering in front of friends and family and said things that felt like confession. "I made a mistake. I hurt someone I love. I'm trying to be better." The sentence eroded some of the varnish off Stella's life. She tried to look furious in a way that would command sympathy, but the frames people had been given of her made the public performance feel hollow. The retribution I had sought was not the kind that broke bank accounts or stole identities. It was the kind that made a woman who had built herself on the illusion of being coveted feel the cold effect of being ordinary. She, who had once been the center of attention, now found people conversing around her, decentering the orbit she had relied upon. The world is cruel in small, cumulative ways. The loneliness she faced was not violent. It was the slow calcification of public regard. Men who had once flirted with her did so with a new tentativeness. Women who had once deferred did so now with the casual distance that comes from knowledge. You might expect me to feel triumphant. Initially, Stella reacted in the only way she could, by trying to stage an exit that made her look like the victim. She posted photos of herself crying in a public place, with a caption about betrayal and the cruelty of those closest to me. She had always been good at directing empathy. Even now, she tried to manipulate public feeling into a pity that would restore her orbit. Some people obliged, but the difference between pity and influence is vast, and the pity she garnered did not translate into the kind of structural power she'd had previously. She was allowed temporary sympathy, but not the long-term adoration she needed. There was a final act of performance that I hadn't expected and didn't entirely know how to navigate. Stella, in an attempt to regain footing, offered an apology to me in public. Insincere, calculated, filmed in short-form social video with a filter that made her eyes glossy. I watched it circulate, watched people comment with thinking face emojis and the occasional "forgive and grow" line that functions as a moral placard. But the apology had an odd effect. It exposed her vulnerability, not as a wound she could use for attention, but as an honest, cracked thing that reflected light differently. People saw the rawness and didn't know what to do with it. The world is messy that way. Sometimes the wound becomes a pathway to empathy. Sometimes it becomes final. What I chose, after all, was not to gloat. I could have made a cinematic show of exposure. I could have posted receipts and revelatory posts that would have left her in tatters. But the satisfaction I felt in that moment didn't require spectacle. I wanted dignity, not debasement. I wanted to reclaim the narrative by living in it. I wanted to be the person who could survive an Achilles heel incident and still go to work, love well, and build a life that required no commentary from people like Stella. The revenge I desired was less a punishment and more a reclamation. Make the life you want so indelibly full that their attempts to reduce you look petty. So I chose to disappear in the sweetest possible way. I kept living. I kept loving. I let the public see me in the things Stella could not be present for because she had given up the right to steady intimacy. Marcus and I reconciled. Not in a cinematic, reconciled way, but with the hard work of people who had committed to honesty. He sat with his shame, apologized, and did the work that makes a relationship credible. We moved forward in a real and stubborn way. I gave interviews not about Stella, but about resilience, about what it means to build a life in an era that confuses spectacle with depth. People listened. Some people cheered. Some people scrolled past. The parts of my life that Stella had once tried to make her playground were no longer public venues for her manipulations. They were mine. The best revenge against someone like Stella isn't to humiliate them in a way that destroys. It's to render them redundant. She had always needed an audience to function. I took away her front row seat. I made sure people who mattered knew the texture of her behavior in a way she could not unspin. I gave her back the emotional consequences of her choices. She tried to salvage anything that suggested control, but she found only open doors and people walking through them without her. I am not a cruel person. I am, however, somebody who learned how to set the stage. In the quiet months after the dinner where I told the story and people saw the pattern with their own eyes, Stella's social invitations became less frequent. At family gatherings, the room didn't bend toward her the way it once did. She tried to repair this with gestures, flowers left anonymously at a table or a donation to one of the charities she'd wanted to chair. But gestures without change are like band-aids on a wound that needs stitches. People notice the lack of stitches. They notice the pattern. That is the kind of lasting thing that gnaws. To be noticed without admiration. On a winter evening, months after the first kiss that started the avalanche, I saw Stella from across a room at a posthumous birthday party for someone we both cared about. She stood alone by the buffet, absently twirling a napkin, her lipstick slightly faded. I felt a flicker of something ancient. Maybe pity? Memory of the small girl who once stole strawberries with me, who taught me how to climb the apple tree. For a moment, I felt foolish for the things I had done to orchestrate her humiliation. Then I watched a woman approach her, hand extended not in friendship, but in the clinical offer of a PR strategy meeting. She did not smile in the way she used to. She was a portrait of someone who had misread the world and now had to relearn its grammar. "Hey," Stella said to me later that night when we were both leaving, the cold air sharp on our faces. I could see the eye roll hanging at the edge of the apology, the performative contrition that could still be used as a showpiece. Instead, she surprised me. She said, "I miss being your person," and there was a crack in the armor that was almost small enough to mend. "I'm sorry for hurting you." Her voice was plain, the kind of voice that might have real regret if she let it. It would have been very easy to say something explosive, to match a melodrama with equal force. Instead, I reached across and touched her hand. One human gesture, not a reconciliation, not an invitation, but a small, honest contact. I said, "You're still my cousin. That doesn't erase what happened." It sounded like an epitaph and not a threat. She nodded, and I watched the light change in her face. Maybe she learned. Maybe she didn't. I can't decide how much cruelty people carry inside them, or whether the acts they commit are their permanent footprints. All I know is this: actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are public, and sometimes they are private, and sometimes they are both. I thought about the way the family would remember it. The dinner where I told the truth, the speech at the garden party, the slow fade of a woman who could no longer command. I thought about the dark, complicated thing inside me that had orchestrated it, the desire to be seen as more than some girl who had let someone walk away with something that belonged to her. I thought about Marcus and how he had become the person who didn't run. I thought about Stella and how she might rebuild or not. I thought about the way my mother had dabbled at the edges of her hair and the look of quiet approval in my father's eyes. Revenge, I learned, is less about spectacle and more about thresholds. You do not have to break a person to reclaim what is yours. You simply need to let the world do the work for you, to expose pattern and watch the public unlearn its reverence. That is what happened to Stella. Not a scandal of record, but a demotion from pedestal. It is a slow thing and a public thing and a private thing all at once. She still moves through rooms with practiced ease, but people no longer lean in the same way. They keep their distance the soft way we learn to maintain boundaries, a kind of collective memory of who she was and what she did. Months later, on an anniversary that used to mean nothing but now felt weighty, Marcus and I sat at our kitchen table and looked at old photographs. There is a particular kind of healing that comes from looking backwards without flinching. We had been through something that could have broken us and hadn't. He took my hand and said, "We did a thing that felt like truth." There were tears and there was laughter and a small private intimacy that wasn't designed for an audience. In the end, I realized what I wanted more than revenge. I wanted a life that could hold the truth and still thrive. Stella's fate, in the sense that mattered most to me, was not a headline. It was the small things, invitations that arrived too late, a board position that passed her by, a woman's phone left unanswered. She became a story people told about a woman who could no longer be counted on to be steady. It was enough. It was, in its way, precise. When I think of her now, I think of a girl in a tree we used to climb, her hair wild, laughing reckless and free. There's a tenderness I can't fully reconcile with the strategist I became. Sometimes at night, I imagine a world where she grew into the person she wanted without trampling others. Sometimes I imagine us both older on a porch, sharing a bottle of something cheap and laughing at all the ways we were young and cruel. Those are not real scenes. The real scene is that Stella exists in my memory and the public record of our social life as someone who tried and failed and now has to live with the consequences. There is a grace in that. There is also an emptiness. I built the theater of her fall because I had to, because watching the person you love choose attention over loyalty is exactly the kind of pain that rearranges the architecture of who you are. The revenge did not make me whole. It made me steady. I could see my reflection in the glass and not flinch. I had her watched, judged, and measured not as the villain that replaced me, but as a person who had stepped into the role and in doing so proved to everyone, including herself, the limits of her own power. Stella moved out of the apartment she had sublet in our neighborhood. She took a job that required travel and a kind of reinvention that was as theatrical as she was. For a while, the gossip circulated, like leaves in fall. Will she come back? Should we let her? People debated. In the end, they made peace with the version of her that fit their life. The final scene is not revenge the way tabloids describe it, with confetti and final words. The final scene is simpler and more devastating. It was the day Stella called me. I was folding laundry, the same domestic choreography that had always comforted me in the worst of days. The phone buzzed on the counter and